I started to learn German around the age of 13, and today I wish it had been earlier. I'm still trying to explain to myself why it was love at first sound. I had a very wise first teacher in a school not famed for its gentleness in those days. Mr. King was that rare thing, a kindly and intelligent man who still determinedly loved his Germany, his own Germany. We were at war with Germany at that time, so it was easy to hate everything about the Germans. But Mr. King wasn't having any of that. He preferred, doggedly, to inspire us with the beauty of the language and its literature and its culture. One day, he used to say, the real Germany will come back. And he was right, because now it has. Why was it love at first sound for me? Well, in those days, not many language teachers played gramophone records to their class, but Mr. King did. And they were old records, very precious to him and to us, and he kept them in brown paper bags in a satchel that he put in his bicycle basket when he rode to school. And what did they contain, these precious records? The voices of classical German actors reading early Romantic German poetry. And the records were a bit cracked, but that was part of their beauty. So it went, Du bist wie eine Blume, so hold und schön und rein. Or, bei Nacht im Dorf, der Wächter rief, crack. And I loved them, these records, and I loved the fun we had listening to them. And I learned to imitate and then to recite. And I loved the idea that these poems and this language were mine, and almost no one else's, because German wasn't a popular subject, and very few of my schoolmates knew anything about it, didn't know a word except Achtung and Hände hoch that they learned from propaganda war movies. But thanks to Mr. King, I knew better. And when I decided I couldn't stand my English school any day anymore, and I needed to bolt from it, it was the German language that provided me with my bolt hole. It was just after the war, and Germany itself was in an awful state. So I went to Switzerland and studied German there, as hard as I could. And in Switzerland, instead of Mr. King, I had Frau Karsten, a stern North German lady with grey hair in a ponytail. And she, like Mr. King, rode a bicycle, sitting very upright, with her grey hair bobbing along behind her. And it's no wonder anymore to me that when later I went into the army for my national service, I was posted to Austria as a German speaker. And that after the army, I went on to study German at Oxford here, and later to teach it. And when I joined the Foreign Office and interpreted at the meetings of great men, British prime ministers, important German statesmen, who in those days, unlike today, didn't by any means all speak English, I knew I wasn't just translating words from one language to another, but mindsets too. I wasn't really very good at it. there was a perfectly awful moment when I was interpreting for Edward Heath at some economic conference. And he said one thing, and I said it in German, and he turned to me and said in English, "That wasn't what I said." And I think Mr. Heath was right. I don't think I was ever a very good interpreter, partly because I'd never trained for the job, but also because somehow I always seemed to get stuck on the bridge between the two languages. And even these days, when just occasionally I'm asked to interpret or translate, I still get stuck on the bridge. Why? Well, for one thing, as every decent interpreter and translator knows, there is no such thing as a perfect translation. Throughout history, the earnest, dedicated translators from German into English or English into German have argued themselves silly about the shades of meaning in great poetry, in drama, in novels, or, heaven help us, in international treaties. And the reasons why they argue so endlessly are twofold. In the first place, they know that great lines of poetry or prose that are beautiful and profound in their original language can only ever be, in translation, a compromise, a second best. So even the greatest translators are filled with a sense of loss as well as triumph at the end of their day's work. But there's another reason, a second reason. It is that people who are lucky enough to have two languages in their heads don't naturally translate. When they're listening in one language and speaking in it, they're also thinking in it. They're not mentally translating at all. They're inhabiting a different skin, using a different pair of ears and a different tongue, and probably different gestures and facial expressions too. So in the aggregate, a kind of different identity. And that's part of the fun, part of the excitement of entering another language. Charles the Great said, that to possess another language is to possess another soul. And that's the wonderful thing that you guys are doing now. So, there is no bridge between languages in that sense. There's just a kind of peaceful coexistence of two identities inside one's head. Now, you can have huge fun with German, which is something we tend to forget. You can tease it. You can play with it. You can send it up. You can invent huge words of your own, but real words, just for the hell of it. Now, I Googled Germany's longest word, and I came up with, wait for it, deep breath, Donau Dampfschifffahrtsgesellschaftskapitän. That is, the company captain of a boat on the Danube. One word. And you can, it was Mark Twain said, you probably know the quote, that some German nouns are so long that they have a perspective. And you can make up crazy adjectives too for yourselves, like my recently by my parents thrown out of the window PlayStation. And when you're tired of floundering with impossible nouns and adjectives all strung together, you can turn for relief to the pristine poems of Hölderlin, or a Goethe, or a Heine, and remind yourself that the German language can also ascend to heights of simplicity and beauty that make it, for many of us in this room, a language of the gods. Now let's talk a bit more about you Olympians, because it's your achievement that we're celebrating, your day, your future, and your fun. The first thing to say is, this is a great competition, and you've won it. It's innovative, it's creative, and it's inspiring. It's not a labor. So congratulations not just to you, but to your teachers, parents, and all the clever, hard-working people who, behind the scenes, who made it happen. And you're the first Olympians. There'll never be other first winners again at this competition, however many German Olympiads there are in the future. So you're pioneers. You've made the first ascent, and that's something not to forget. With your linguistic gifts, you will discover a Germany that even today, surprisingly few Brits know anything about. You'll be able to separate regions by voice and character. You'll hear and feel the difference between North and South. You'll discover that Germans, like Brits, are branded on the tongue. You'll be able to spot a Rhinelander, a Bavarian, or a Prussian. You'll be at home in German theatre, at the cabaret, in the cinema. You will have privileged access to Europe's most powerful and most exciting, and for Brits, least explored nation. You'll meet some of the best Europeans there are, the most idealistic, the best informed, the most liberal, and most cultivated. And you'll never let anyone tell you that Germans have no sense of humor. And if you're really lucky, you'll make friends with German literature and discover that a lot of writers who at the moment may look like unscalable mountains are actually quite easy climbs, and the climb is worth it. And what are you going to give German in return? For one thing, your human curiosity in a nation that sometimes thinks it has lived too long without friends. For you, the War of 39-45 will be as remote as the Battle of Waterloo is for me. The last echo of the anti-German voices that have lingered for far too long in our British newspapers and media will have faded away for good. And you will be the inheritors and the enjoyers, the Genießer, of our two inseparably intertwined, unsere untrennbar miteinander verbundenen cultures. So from all of us, unsere Glückwünsche and well done. Now, in a minute, I'm going to shake each of you by the hand. I'll tell you why this is terribly important. Goethe's dates, as I'm sure you know, were 1749 to 1832. And in 1949, I was a young student at Bern University. And perhaps the greatest writer of the 20th century, Thomas Mann, came from America, where he'd been in exile, to celebrate Goethe's second centenary. And he spoke, we all went, we students, into the casino, which is not a gaming house, it was a big, big hall in Bern. And Thomas Mann, wearing a very formal suit, delivered a remote, largely incomprehensible speech. And we listened avidly, and I was immensely proud to be in the presence of Thomas Mann, even if I didn't really get the drift. And in the middle of his speech, or towards the end, some of the students at my university took exception to the fact that he'd been in exile during the war and started shouting at him and accusing him of cowardice. And I was so deeply shocked that when his speech was over and he'd withdrawn, I went and found his dressing room. And in those days, there was no security as we understand it now. And I banged on the door. And this great, slender man opened it himself and he was wearing braces, and he said, "Was wollen Sie?" And I said, "Ich wollte Ihre Hand schütteln. I wanted to shake your hand." To which he replied, "Well, here it is. Hier ist sie." So we shook hands. So when you shake hands with me, you are shaking hands with Thomas Mann.